Welcome to the final panel in the CFE Spring Series of virtual panels. I'm Jim Turk, Director of the Center for Free Expression. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land in which I'm speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. Today's panel is being co-sponsored by the Edmonton Public Library, the Milton Public Library, the Thunder Bay Public Library, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library. And we'd like to thank our co-sponsors for their support. CFE panels attempt to explore difficult but important issues, attempting to better understand the complexity and nuance necessary if we are to move forward amidst the deep polarization that increasingly infects our democracy and the public discourse on which it depends. Today we are discussing racial politics in the post-George Floyd era. Online harms, hate crime units, appealing to big tech to censor speech, EDI, that's equity, diversity, and inclusion, are all being touted as anti-racist initiatives. But are they? How do they fit in with the legacy of Black radical tradition, of freedom of expression? There are so many questions. What's the role of class in the current struggle? Are identity politics counter-revolutionary? We have an impressive panel to explore these and many related issues. I'd like to introduce them to you. First, I'd like to introduce Desmond Cole. Desmond is a Canadian journalist, activist, author, and broadcaster. He'd been a columnist for the Toronto Star. He's written for the Walrus, Now Magazine, the Tyee, Toronto Life, BuzzFeed, and others. In May of 2017, Desmond resigned from his column at the Toronto Star after being told by the editor he had violated the newspaper's rules on journalism and activism by protesting Toronto Police Services Board meeting over the Toronto Police practice of carding and racial profiling. His activism has received national attention, focusing on issues of police carding, racial discrimination, and the dismantling of systemic racism. He's the author of The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power, which was released in January 2020 and won the Toronto Book Award. Welcome, Desmond.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Our second panelist is Elle Jones. Elle is a poet, a journalist, professor, and a community advocate living in Halifax. She was the 5th Poet Laureate of Halifax and a 2015 resident of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. She was poet in residence at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus in 2021. She's won 2 Atlantic Journalism Gold Awards. She was a recipient of the Burnley Rocky Jones Human Rights Award. And congratulations for this, she recently successfully defended her PhD in Cultural Studies at Queen's and is an assistant professor in the Department of Political and Canadian Studies at Mount St. Vincent University. Welcome, Elle.
Thank you.
Our third panelist is Adolph Reed, Jr. Adolph is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He's taught at Howard, Yale, Northwestern, the University of Illinois at Chicago, and the New School for Social Research. In 2019, Adolph was the inaugural scholar in residence at the McKenna Center for Leadership at St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish. He's the author of numerous books. His most recent is titled The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives, plus the author of countless articles and book chapters. He has been a columnist in The Progressive, Village Voice, The New Republic, and has written extensively for The Nation, Dissent, and nonsite.org, where his most recent article is entitled, Let me Go Get My Big White Man, the Clientelist Foundation of Contemporary Anti-Racist Politics. Cornel West has described Adolph as the leading left political theorist of his generation. Welcome, Adolph.
Oh, hi, Jim. It's always great to be with you and to be in Canada, even if only virtually.
Well, we're happy you're here. The moderator for this impressive panel is Vershawn Ashanti Young. Vershawn known as Dr. Vey, is a professor of Black Studies, Communications Arts, and English at the University of Waterloo. He has been writing for newspapers and magazines for more than 20 years. He's a member of the Center for Free Expression's Advisory Board. He's also a solo performance artist. I understand has a law degree as well, and is author or co-author of 10 books, including the forthcoming This Ain't Yesterday's Literacy, Culture and Education After George Floyd. Also the Rutledge Reader of African American Rhetoric, and Neo-Passing, Performing Identity After Jim Crow. Welcome, Vey. The format for today's panel is going to be a conversation amongst the four of our guests. After about 45 minutes or so of conversation, they'll turn to the audience for questions. So if each of you would look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. The chat function is disabled for this, but the Q&A function works. So if a question comes to mind while you're listening to the panelists talk, just go at that point and write down your question. And Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator of the center, will read out the questions when Vey turns to her for audience questions. So please feel free to jot down your questions as you think of them. You don't have to wait till the panel turns to the audience. I think that's everything I have to say. So we'll turn it over to all of you.
Thank you, Jim. I'm happy to get us started here. I'm going to ask a question of my other panelists, but I want to preface that question with something that Oprah Winfrey said 2 years ago. Oprah convened a panel after the murder of George Floyd in about June of 2020. And she had some elite guests there, including the director, Ava DuVernay, and some actors and political figures and religious people. And this is what she said then. She said that she'd been talking on television about racism for about 35 years. And she indicated that she'd done some 100 shows on racism, including a feature on the LA riots and Rodney King. But she was making a distinction between all of those shows and her 35 years of discussing racism with what the current situation was. And she said in all of those experiences, she didn't recall a moment quite like this one. Because as she said, we find North America on a precipice. She said the same question keeps popping up over and over and over again. Will this be the moment that changes our country? Will this be the moment that changes our countries? My question emanating from that is this: post-2020, post the 2020 landscape, what are the concerns about Black political discourse that my fellow panelists have observed? Or concerns that you think about? Desmond?
Thank you very much, Vey. I can almost hear Oprah in her voice saying that in my mind, even though I never saw the clip. Maybe I'll start with what she asked and say that I don't know why there has to be a moment. And I think that it's easy to maybe look back in history and select what people think were the moment for, I don't know, Rosa Parks or a Birmingham school or whatever moment people want to pick now and say that was the moment or a moment. I don't know how helpful that is, but it's certainly one of the first questions that always gets asked, and I find it annoying. As if America or Canada is going to have an awakening. And I particularly think that this is an interesting idea in Canada, even though Oprah wasn't asking Canadians that question, we all decided to ask ourselves that question anyway. And it's like, is this thing that happened in another country going to be the moment that our country wakes up? And I just think like if Black people, for example, being murdered by the police in our country doesn't move us, why would we believe that it would when it happens somewhere else? The sensationalism of people being able to watch George Floyd die, the depravity of that, I think really skewed people's understanding of what was actually happening. It was really about people being allowed to watch a Black person suffer in this really horrific way and to pass judgment, in my opinion. To be able to say, well, you know, I've heard some stories about the police and a lot of them I think are maybe okay. Maybe this one was beyond the line, but it was a privilege almost in some very disturbing way. I think that people felt that they got the opportunity to really see this for themselves and to judge it. But I don't know how watching someone lose their life on film, as if that's never happened before in America or in our country in Canada, create some opportunity for hope or really substantive change. We got a lot of things. When I say we, I'm going to say like Black people who have been fighting for changes and against racism. We got a lot of things after George Floyd was murdered that we didn't ask for. We got a lot of corporations taking racist mascots off of their products. We got a lot of pledges from political leaders about how they are personally anti-racist and committed to that cause. We got increases in police funding in a moment where we were really pushing for the opposite. We got a lot of things that we didn't ask for and that we were not fighting for, because I think that there was a desire to make some concessions when so many people were in the streets in 2020 for such a prolonged period of time. But the concessions had little to do with like the real day-to-day needs of people. So Oprah's probably like somebody who benefits from the idea that there can be moments, because she wants people to tune in and have their hearts changed by what they see on her TV show. But I don't really know what that has to do with the rest of us in the day-to-day grind that we're fighting. And I lament that we've really desecrated the name of George Floyd in many ways by suggesting that getting to watch him die somehow makes us all human or better, or opens up opportunities for us that were not there before we watched him die.
I'm going to jump in, I guess. But you look like you're about to say something, and I was like,
go right
and I
ahead.
see Adolph leaning in as well.
Adolph will probably, waiting for you, Al.
Okay, Adolph will probably do a better job of some of this history than I will, but I want to take us back to, you know, another great moment in the world, which is 1968, of course, which was supposed to be this year of revolution around the globe. And in Canada, that was, of course, the year of the Black Writers and Artists Congress in Montreal. And that led to, of course, George Williams campus. And in Halifax, it led to the organization of BUF, the Black United Front, which was a political party formed by people like Rocky Jones, partly in response to the destruction of Africville and the recognition that we had no political power as a Black community. We'd been unable to stop the bulldozers from coming into our communities, and that as Black communities across the province, people extremely fractured. So they called a Black community meeting, and the idea was out of this, we would get the Black United Front as a political party. And that operation, as many people will know, and I encourage you to read Rocky's biography if you don't know who I'm talking about. It's actually sitting on my desk because I refer to it so much. So I'm talking about this book here, many of you are familiar with, Burnley, Rocky Jones Revolutionary. And in it, he recounts how immediately the elite classes of Blacks, when they saw that they couldn't stop BUF from forming, immediately got themselves voted into positions on BUF. Rocky disappears to go to Montreal for the George Williams campus. This is the uprising there. And in his absence, people immediately begin going to the government and bargaining and essentially saying, do you want this radical running this? Or do you want us who, you know, can actually work with you? So if you give us government funding, we will act as gatekeepers for this community. So my point is, we have seen this before, and there's a historical pattern where we have some kind of move towards a mass movement, some kind of radical move, and an immediate move that is almost inevitable, where this is the government, the state, along with Black elites find a way to crack down on it. So we shouldn't have been surprised when we saw the same mechanism happen in 2020, as it happened over and over again. And one of the questions that I kept asking, although it's not really a question, is how did we begin with a Black man murdered by a cop supposedly overpassing a bad $20 bill, and end in we need more Black businesses, right? Like we just took a capitalist trajectory here. So we had no questioning of property, no questioning of money, no questioning of the role of capitalism in all of this class. We went to straight, so particularly in Canada, we ended up with a bunch of new organizations. We ended up with endless initiatives around funding Black businesses. And I can't begin to, I mean, I know why, because it places us firmly within capitalism, consumerism. It does nothing to shift the status quo. And of course, nothing that actually went to these fundamental issues of what made George Floyd open for violence. Why does police violence happen? Why did it happen to this particular person? Why does it happen to the so-called underclasses? We didn't have a discussion on that. And in fact, what we had was Black Bay Street people putting on I Am George Floyd shirts, as though there was no difference between them and George Floyd. And this kind of discourse where in particular the Black middle classes, elites, and I count myself in this as an academic, are able to take these moments, and we get on the news, we get the requests for books, we get the speaking engagements, and then we end up with a bunch of grants that nobody else gets to access except a small circle of people, and people are still living in shelters. Of course, we had COVID at the same time. People are still in prison, people are still facing deportation, and we really, as a community, did absolutely nothing to really concentrate on those issues. We were quite content with getting these organizations. And I know Adolph Reed will have much more to say on this, much more, because this is something that he's been thinking about for a long, long time. But I think this is always my starting point. How do we actually have a mass movement? How do we get one that doesn't immediately, decide, do we need one? Like, what is it that we need to do in our organizing, not mobilizing, but our organizing to actually sustain some kind of resistance to the state? Because one of the problems of living within a neoliberal state, I think, is that you come to the belief that there really is no way to win. There's always this kind of despair. So then we become satisfied with smaller and smaller gestures, right? At least we can get an EDI committee. At least we can get some funding, $25 million, at least for the first time in the budget, like these kind of things, because we fundamentally don't believe in our capacity for change. We actually, I think, are quite cynical about it. And we believe the state is everywhere and we'll never actually conquer the police. And we'll never actually get out of house. We'll never get these things. So let's settle for something else. And I'm going to throw to Adolph here because I think that he'll be able to pick this up very well. But I think for me, that is this idea around this moment. Like, how do we fumble these moments? How do we believe in these moments in ways that actually stop us from organizing in long-term ways? And why is it, particularly in Canada, that we have so ceded the political landscape to this small class of self-appointed elites within these organizations that gain their power from basically the ability to sit in proximity to white power, and then to get that power for themselves, right? Like, we just need more Black ministers. We just need more Black people on the board. We just need more Black professors. We just need more Black people in the board of governors. And that becomes our project, and not these broader projects of global solidarity, not the broader projects of class solidarity. And the last thing I'll say is, why do we also keep believing that this revolution is going to come from the global north while we watch in the global south, Chile on the move, Haiti on the move? We've had so many of countries in Latin America and Africa that have been in these revolutionary actions, and we still believe that somehow something that happens in the US is going to be the center of how we get global change as well. So I'm going to throw to Adolph now. Hopefully that was all coherent.
Hi, yeah, well, thanks, Al. And I don't have much to say except to build on what my comrades and colleagues have said, although I will confess, I'm still reeling from being gobsmacked at having learned that Oprah had been talking about race and racism for 35 years. I don't remember it, actually. And what I do remember was a lot of people complaining that she didn't, but I guess I must have misunderstood.
She had the neo-Nazis on, remember?
Yes, she did. She did have them on a couple times, actually. Well, yeah, I mean, look, I would definitely second everything that Elle said. And so, like, maybe a way into adding is like this. There's the great American muckraker, Lincoln Steffens, told a story once about having met with an Episcopal bishop in California someplace. And they were talking about the Garden of Eden story, right? And Steffens said, so I think that you church people have got it all wrong. Like, some of you blame Adam, some blame Eve, some blame the snake. And he said, but I blame the apple, right? And in his case, the point was property. in our case, with respect to the problem of Black political discourse and the Black movement, I really think that the problem that we have to overcome is a misdirection around the idea of a Black community. And I'll preface this by pointing out that I'm a product of the events of 1968. When I came into the movement around Black Power, actually, this was my formative political experience. And over about a decade of watching leftists lose ground to mainstream and petty bourgeois politicians, I eventually came to recognize that part of the problem was that what we posited as our ideal constituency, the radicals, was a generic and abstract Black community, not Blacks as working people or teachers or parents or students, or any socially meaningful identity and social location, right? Other than racial identity. And what that means with respect to politics is a couple things. One is that in everyday practice, right, the symbols of racial authenticity are abstract. They aren't really tied to specific agendas, and they have mainly to do with who can be understood authentically or genuinely to speak for the Black community, right? And the other problem is that this way of understanding the Black population, and it sounds like it's to whatever degree true in Canada as it is in the US, and I know that American imperialism has been trying to propagate this kind of view in Brazil and Cuba and elsewhere. The notion that people who are understood to be Black or who understand themselves to be Black can have their politically meaningful identity reduced to their racial classification has its origins, right, in the sort of clientelist politics that took shape with Booker T. Washington at the end of the 19th century. The historian Michael Rudolph West, in a great book called The Education of Booker T. Washington, on the origin of the race relations idea, makes this point that from whenever you want to start counting, right, to 1865, the Negro problem, like in American politics, always had to do with slavery. Then when emancipation came, well, the Negro problem didn't have to do with slavery anymore, and it's not really clear what the Negro problem was, partly because Black freedmen were able to participate as more or less fully functioning citizens with rights. Rights were always challenged, right, and under duress, but were able to participate to shape their own worlds and to shape their own political environments. When we get to the end of the 19th century, and I don't want to turn this into a disquisition, but what the defeat of Reconstruction and eventually the defeat of populism brought about was first disfranchisement that took away Black Americans' effective civic voice, and Northern Republicans and liberals with a wink and a nod, and often a wink and a nod to themselves, decided that the better part of valor was to cede the Negro problem, which popped up once again, to the white South, right? The white South was best equipped to know how to deal with the Negro problem. And of course, what that meant was suppression, racial domination, explicit white supremacy. Well, but then you've got this contradiction, right? The contradiction is on one side, according to the Constitution, Blacks are full citizens and are participating civic members of American life. But the reality was that they weren't. How do you finesse it? And as West argues, the beauty of the notion of race relations and the idea that all Black people can be reduced to their racial identity was that Blacks disappear from civically meaningful roles, like teachers, workers, parents, trade unionists, ship caulkers, right, preachers, lawyers, or whatever, and exist only as the Negro, later updated to the Black person and then the African American, right? And my point is that late 19th century premise and way of thinking about the place of Black people in American society is the origin of the ethnic pluralism that's been dominant since the post, or all through the post-World War II era. And what that means is it is that elites have never really sold out the Black community. The idea of a uniformitarian Black community was a product of elites' ideology from the very beginning. So I'll just stop there. Well, I guess I'll say one more thing about the 2020 moment. Yeah, I mean, I'm the kind of historicist as a social scientist who doesn't like those moments, right? Because in the first place, you can only know whether a moment has historic significance after the fact, right? And people proclaim it, but that's the difference between historical analysis and selling advertising copy, right? I mean, if you're selling advertising copy, then you're proclaiming that this toothpaste is going to have an historic impact. But so I'll stop on that.
I'll chime in on my concerns that may also segue into another topic that we can discuss. And also, please feel free to jump in on other topics as well. I have observed, or one of my concerns by observation and making a distinction between America and Canada is that in Canada, there doesn't seem to be much of a Black political discourse at all. When I compare the discursive practices of Black people arguing for or promoting or organizing for Black progress or racial progress more generally, I can't find a comparison in Canada. It just doesn't really seem to be, at least in the observable mainstream. As a matter of fact, it seems to me, and I'm going to speak somewhat directly, and please chime in and correct my observations and point to different areas. But it seems that the potential for a Black political discourse or discourses are truncated by various institutional power structures that are still driven by not just white people, but whitely people and white supremacist ideas. Let me give you an example of what I mean to concretize this. One of the arguments that I make in my own particular context as a professor at the University of Waterloo, which did something like what you all have been describing, particularly Ale pointing, there was an initiative to hire 10 Black professors and 10 Indigenous professors that came after, as a result of making changes post George Floyd. My argument has been, what's going to be different in this environment when 10 new Black people come to a place where you only had 3 or 4, Black professors for the long term? Like Desmond was saying, shouldn't this have been an observable fact already? And someone should have said or could have said without George Floyd having to been murdered and ensuing protests that this is a travesty, right? There is an absence here of not only diversity, but of thought and perspectives that emanate from people's particular subject positions. So I tend to worry that we don't have discourses about this. And I predict that there will be a proliferation of problems, professional problems, ethical problems, particularly in the university, because we don't have this conversation, because we haven't had it. And you're going to get 10 Black people who are going to be subject to the same white supremacist perspectives, ideas, and policies, and then the finger is going to be pointed to the Black people as problems. This is why they weren't here in the first place. This is why et cetera, et cetera. So that to me is a problem. Who should have that conversation? Not just Black people, right? Black political discourse, I think we need to have all kinds of people in that conversation. And it needs, and people, I think, should come from an autoethnographic perspective. I personally think that people who are not Black, and I'll say more about this in a second, and white people in particular really need to self-reflect and talk and think about how their cultural dispositions, how the cultures that they have been raised in, that their ideologies have been developed from, contributes to white supremacy, and how they need to interrogate ways to change those cultures. I have a concern, I was going to say a problem, but I'm going to try to massage that and say a concern. I have a concern with the way in which when a particular kind of event or problem or tragedy happens to Black people or a Black person, that it gets widened out to all other minority groups. Not that all other minority groups are not subject to various kinds of racism, but there is a tendency, or let me rephrase it. There is a fear. There is a rhetorical fear that emanates from an ideological and emotional fear, mostly among white people, to deal with and talk specifically about Black issues. So what they do is generalize it so that the signifier cannot be the focus, right? They make it a shifting signifier in order to say, oh, this group or that group or this group or that group and this group and that one, instead of focusing on this particular problem. So those are the concerns that I have. I actually think that, for me, I think there are problems with the elite and the underclass and with them being vis-a-vis or in contradistinction to each other. I actually think we need all of them. You need people like us, professors and writers who are dedicated and immersed in this topic in various ways. I'm not a political scientist, I am a humanist, but I appreciate the political scientist, I appreciate the writer, I appreciate the cultural studies person, I appreciate the underclass efforts, I appreciate the elite efforts. When we pose them as opposites, as opposing views, I think that is a fundamental problem. I think we have to see the benefit in all of them. Let me give you an example, then I'll move off of this. Reed spoke about Booker T. Washington, right? We know some of at least the public discursive history of Washington vis-a-vis a more radical person, people would say like Du Bois, right? Instead of pitting Du Bois against Washington, and of course, Du Bois has a chapter in Souls of Black Folks in which he addresses this issue and talks about Booker T. Washington. But instead of pitting Washington and Du Bois, what is the benefit? What are the advantages and the disadvantages to his particular model of education, Washington's model of education, his, for lack of a better term, segregationist, accepting politics, where he say that Black people could be from white people and others as separate as the 5 fingers on my hand, but unified as the hand, which many people thought was an endorsement of segregation. And then
it was actually, right?
Yeah, an endorsement of segregation. And then Du Bois's position that we really need Black people not in industrial schools learning trades to go out and learn, although that I don't think he really disparaged that unequivocally, but that we need their minds to be edified, their hearts to be edified in university education and partnering with the Black community when he clarified his idea about the talented 10. So instead of pitting these groups to get against each other, what about thinking about them as having benefits that promote Black people, Blackness, Black political discourses that also have racial benefits for other groups as well?
I think Desmond's going to take a lot of this. I'll go quickly. I know Desmond has thoughts.
Sure.
So I think we're heading into EDIA here, and I know Desmond has a lot of thoughts on that. But very briefly on EDIA, I'll say one of the things it does not take into account is political orientation, right? So for example, I taught precariously within universities in my province for like a decade before 2020, and nobody was interested in hiring me largely because they thought I'd be a troublemaker and I'd say radical things. So part of the problem, and this is what Adolph was talking about with the sort of flattening of the Black community, is that there's this idea that as long as we have a Black face, but of course some Black faces can be conservative. Some Black faces do criminology and like talk about how the biggest problem with the cops is like Black cops face racism, and some Black people believe that police should be abolished, right? And if a university can choose, they're going to choose the one that interviews the cops and does data, and not the one that thinks prison should be abolished. So by flattening it into this idea, and you were also saying this, Vey, with kind of, then it just becomes all diversity is this mishmash, and what does that even mean? Desmond will say more on that, so I'm going to leave that to him. But I think the specific question about Canadian political discourse, people talk about this a lot with like Canadian culture, is that we're so mediated through the government. Because everything's through grants. So our cultural landscape is very much defined by who can get a Canada Council grant, who has this access. And of course, that tends towards particular forms of conservative discourse or group discourse. So it's very hard to be on a leading edge of discourse in Canada, because then you don't, an organization doesn't want you to speak there because that will affect their government funding. You're not going to get Canada Council grant because that's too radical. So it has a flattening effect. So on the one hand, we have this access to public money that, as I understand, does not exist in the same way in the States, where like it's mostly private foundations, whereas ours are government. But the flip side of that is we're always in this relation to government where like the main concern is, but will the government give me money for this? And of course, what the government loves to fund is anything. I mean, when I complain about this, people be like, why the hell would they give you money to let people out of prison? Like, that's not the point of the state. Like, the state's not giving money so you can like organize people in prison to fight their captors. Of course, they don't want to do that. They want to paint Sankofa birds on the wall and say that, that's a cultural initiative in prison. So I think that part of the discourse in Canada is that. And then secondly is this idea of our unified community. I think all of us have been canceled in various ways, I'm sure. And one of the things that will get you canceled for sure in Canada is if you start addressing and stepping out of line with what is perceived as this kind of discourse of unity. And I'm sure that's true everywhere, but I think it's particularly vicious in Canada where we're small and scattered and we don't really have a national sense. Our identities are often regional, like in particular ways, right? And so under this guise of having this like national Black community, what is exited is Black radicals. Because it's like, stop it. You guys are challenging the senator. You guys are challenging, we experienced this fighting a deportation. How dare you challenge the Black immigration minister? He's important and we only have one. So it makes radical discourse increasingly different because there's always a one-way thing that we're expected to silence ourselves for the interests of group unity. But anyone can attack a Black radical at any time, and that's not group unity, right? It doesn't go both ways. They don't have to keep gloves off on us, but we have to keep gloves off. And I think most young activists go through this where you start by talking exclusively about white people, white supremacy, what white people do, and that's all good. I mean, people get uncomfortable with you, but it's when you really start talking about this, how adjacency to white power in the Black community, that's when you just get it in the neck. So I think that in Canada, one of our sort of deadened discourses is you're really, really, really not allowed to think or talk about how power operates within the Black community and with institutions. And as we get more and more people in positions of power, this becomes extremely, how do you have a political discourse when you can't acknowledge that some Black people are cabinet ministers and some Black people are judges and some Black people are presidents of universities, and those people may not be, as Zora Neale Hurston said, our kinfolk. They may be skinfolk, but they're not kinfolk. And what does that mean? And I don't think we've had a very robust discussion in Canada about that, like how power impacts us, whether that's senior academics versus junior academics, whether that's like, so we always have these initiatives like we want more Black judges. And we're not like, what about the courts as a whole, you know? So I just think that's part of Canada. I'm going to stop talking because I know, Desmond, you haven't talked in a while. And I know you have thoughts on EDI. So
let me jump in one moment and sort of ask for just a little bit of nuance or clarification of whatever the term may be here. It's not that we're asking or that there's asking for more Black judges. It sounds like what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there are certain types of Black people, certain kinds of Black people that may get to be a judge or a cabinet minister, and other types or other kinds, like the Black radicals, may be excluded from those, although equally qualified.
It's not even about that. I mean, I don't have a problem with there being Black judges. I mean, there's enough white judges. So if Black people are going to be judges, why shouldn't they be judges in the same way white people are? I just don't know that that's the process for, getting rid of Black people in prisons, right? Like, my issue isn't that I think there's been enough mediocre white people in every position. So if Black people want to be in positions, we should be in them, and we know we've been held back. We have the same, needs, and if we want to say, I don't want to say right, but of course, Black people want to, have professional jobs, and there's nothing wrong with that. I just don't know if that's the project of representation. Right. It's a political project I'm invested in.
Yes, but let me push one more again, as they say, one more again, on just this particular point, in order to see if there's more. There was a judge in Louisville, Kentucky, Olu Stevens, who dismissed 2 all-white juries when the defendants were Black men, because he said that those juries did not represent a fair cross-section of the community. I just want to point that to your point where you said you don't know whether or not having more Black judges will make the kind of impact that you're arguing for. And I want to say, true, but this was a radical judge. He actually got suspended for doing that, right? They wouldn't allow him to do it. So my point, like, after he did it, he went, the state's attorney brought him up against the judicial committee that said, you know what, you can't be doing that. Looks like reverse racism. But in fact, he was the kind of, for lack of a better term, radical judge that was trying to make an impact so that those defendants would have at least representation, racial representation from the community, and not be an all-white jury. So I'm saying, I think the project goes back to the earlier comment, at least my belief, that the project can be both and.
Yeah, I'm not against that. Like, and Judge Nakatsuru has done an amazing set of decisions in Canada, but I would suggest, for my own energies, that, for example, people in prison who are organizing labor unions, people that are organizing habeas corpus applications in prison to fight those conditions, there's so much less attention on that, which is where historically we know that a lot of changes have come from prison rebellions, prison uprisings, prison organizing, and then the connection of prison organizing to broader social movements. We're so lackadaisical about that. And then we'll put all our energies into, what if we just had more Black crowns? So I'm not against I'm not saying I disagree with Black judges or Black university professors. I am one, or, whatever. But our project has become almost solely focused on those classes, as though what we need is trickle down politics, right? If we just get a judge or a cabinet minister, that will trickle down to the rest of us. I don't believe that. I think we have to go bottom up politics, grassroots up, organize the prisons, organize the housing, organize those things. And we're going to get more from that. But we can, so I see what you're like. I'm not creating a totality where it's all or one, all or nothing. I'm saying that our focus has overwhelmingly, especially when you look at what we're asking government for, it's so often these grants and we need this representation, and not we need the tools to organize prisoners. We need the tools to organize tenants. We need the tools to organize women living in shelters. And how do we connect that to workers and unions? And how do we connect that outwards, right? So I'm talking too much. I think other people should jump in.
I'll jump in at this point. So much has been said. I find myself thinking about Black History Month in Canada and this kind of like great man theory of history, or sometimes less often great woman theory. where we can understand the Black experience through a few chosen individuals. This is what this conversation is bringing up for me right now. And so Black history in Canada is like, how have Black people contributed to the colonial project that dominates this stolen territory? How have we helped that happen, right? How have we validated ourselves within this colonial project called Canada? Whereas what Elle's talking about is like, you know, like Black people have been organizing, for example, if we want to talk about immigration and the immigration practices of this country that either didn't let Black people in or let them in under very specific and stringent circumstances. Black people, ordinary, if you want to call them that, Black people have been organizing against that for decades. Black people have been organizing against the police for decades in this country, in Canada, like unearthing the history of Black people who are, as maybe Adolph was talking about earlier, a teacher or a laborer or just working in a kind of working class existence, unearthing those people's struggles, which have been happening in this country for such a long time, is, I think, part of the like really urgent and important work that needs to be done now. Otherwise, you just get the first Black X and the first Black Y, and that's Black history, and that's all we need to know. And that really does promote a notion that if enough of us get into these upper echelons of wherever, then we're all going to be saved, as if our own people aren't throwing us back into the slave ship, as it were, in many cases. Like, so I think that that's why when I learned more about like domestic workers organizing in Canada, or nurses, my mom's a nurse, Black nurses not being allowed to go to nursing school in Canada and actually leaving and going to the segregated parts of the United States to go get a nursing degree because they weren't allowed to have one in Canada. Those things are interesting to me because they're actually not about like one great hero who got into government and sat nicely next to all of the white people in the class photograph. Like the Black Action Defense Committee organizing here after the deaths of people like Michael Wade Lawson and Lester Donaldson, and Black people being always a very small minority within a city like Toronto or the country more generally, having the power to hit so hard above our weight. The buff in Nova Scotia being something that people wanted to co-opt in government because they were afraid of it, right? We have this tremendous power as Black people in this country to get together and to organize and to push for things well above what I think might be expected of us given our population and the historical forces that have been attacking us and still are. So I think it's important for us as journalists to, because you know what, Obama and Oprah and you know, Michael Jean, these things are really sexy for the elite class, for the political class, and they feed into this, I think, very misleading idea that that's what's changing things for the everyday Black person. Okay, and I'll say one more thing and then I'll turn it over, but like, I'm not all pessimistic as I might have sounded at the opening in terms of what's happened since George Floyd. I know students in Hamilton, in Ottawa, in Mississauga and Brampton, in Peel region, here in Toronto, just in my own local neck of the woods, who have successfully organized to get local police officers out of their school. The majority of the students that I have connected with who are doing this work are Black. Many of them are immigrants themselves or are the children of immigrants. And they are not part of this great man theory of history thing that we like to do all the time, but they're doing the work in their local communities and they're having a tremendous amount of success. They're bringing new people into coalitions. They're educating themselves and other people in their communities. Are we doing the work to make sure that those stories and those forms of resistance are being documented so that the conversation doesn't need to only be about the next political figure, the next person in the judiciary, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, both of you guys said a lot, but and I'm processing it. But let me think. Say a couple things. One is that, like, Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I came up in a tradition that just assumed that people don't like being oppressed, and when they're oppressed, they try to resist, right? And on the other side, right, it's like the other side that that tries to paper over the history of people's the resistance to oppression. But I can never treat it like news to find out that it's happened, because that's what I step off from as an essential component of the human condition. I don't think there's any disagreement between us, right? I mean, on those points at all. But also I was thinking, and this is almost like a random thought, Elle, but well, I'll make one point before I make the other. The reason I made that point that I just did is, I understand that the situation is more fluid in Canada than it is here, but I'm kind of governed in the U.S. by the reality that between now and the end of 2022, there's like not much better than a 50-50 proposition that we're going to wind up with some kind of authoritarian coup in this country, right? And they might not call it a coup, they might call it a constitutional coup like they did in Brazil, but if the right in the U.S. takes all three branches of government, then even the sort of one version of democracy that we have will be gone for at least a generation. So all of my short-term political thinking is governed by that midterm threat. Okay. A funny thing, Elle, I was thinking about when you were talking about the dependence of progressives in Canada on the government, is that here we would love to be dependent, or a lot of us would love to be dependent on the government, because at least if that's who funded us, and it was like this in the 60s and the 70s to some extent, but if that's who funded us, we could mobilize to bring public pressure on the public institutions to alter funding streams and policies. You might not succeed, right? And in fact, like with everything else that we do as a leftist, the greater likelihood is that we'd fail. Like I've often said to students that if you want to be active in politics, like on this side of the ledger, you need to adopt the mindset of a Major League Baseball player, where if you're successful 3 times out of 10, you go to the Hall of Fame. But the situation we have now is these damn private foundations. And they're even less and less the institutional ones than the rich philanthropists who are paying stuff off, right? Jeff Bezos gave Van Jones $100 million one day, right? And this actually takes me back, and I didn't really want to sort of draw our contemporary discussion back to how we think about things that happened at the end of the 19th century. But I think it's important, like, to clarify something about the Washington moment. Because Washington wasn't just a guy with a plan. Washington was installed in a role of Negro leader that never existed before him. And people never asked, well, who made him a Negro leader? How did one get to be a Negro leader in 1895? And the answer is that one got to be a Negro leader in 1895 in the same way that one gets to be one today, which is the ruling class tells people that you won and they make you one. So it's not just that Washington had a plan for the free people. Washington was a conscious, willing, and active minion of the white supremacist forces that were installing the Jim Crow order at the end of the 19th century. And look, I mean, it's not a matter of making a determination who goes to heaven, who goes to hell, right? I mean, Du Bois was part of the same class. There were a lot of others of them. But everybody's dead. So wherever who's going to go in the afterlife has long since been determined. But the point, or I think the way that we should think about examining history isn't looking for sources of inspiration randomly from the past, for instance, but trying to understand how dynamics set in motion and enacted and advanced by actors in the past, in the midst of the big complex of social forces that that they were enmeshed in, helped to produce the circumstances that eventuated in our having the problems to deal with that we have to deal with today. And I think, I mean, otherwise, well, I'll just stop there for now.
Well, the thing here is to just ask a follow-up is how does you said that how you asked the question, the rhetorical question, how does a Black person or how does a Black leader get to be a Black leader?
Right.
Said it is the same way with Washington as it is today. The thing about this, though, is that their particular speech or discourses were about Blackness, right?
Well, I'll tell you something. Wait, one comment on that point, because it's something my son just said to me this morning, and his quip was a little tighter than I think the way that I'm going to reproduce it. But what he said is the race analysis works well for the professional and managerial classes, no matter what their racial classification. The class analysis works well for the working class, no matter what their racial classification. Elle put her finger on it earlier, right? Like the racial agenda promises the vast mass of Black working people a trickle down, right? And the clearest example of that is all roads now lead to this thing called the racial wealth gap, which no matter how hard the proponents of challenging the racial wealth gap as the prime agenda for all Black people today try to shout past this brute fact. The fact is that the racial wealth gap exists almost entirely between the richest 10% of Black people and the richest 10% of white people. And the substantive program of closing the racial wealth gap can be only making rich Black people slightly richer in relation to rich white people than they already are. The vast majority of Black people get nothing out of that. Bubblegum in hard times, and they're always out of bubblegum, right? And like this is the clearest characterization of a class agenda you can possibly imagine. And I mean, just as racial scapegoating has worked for the other side since the race idea was invented, you know, as a form of scapegoating, it works for our side too, right? I mean, it works for our side too, because people like Sandy Darity and others, and reparations advocates or whatever, pretend that there's some way that a racial wealth transfer is going to benefit anybody, any Black Americans, except those rich people who are in a position to get the jobs to benefit from it and get the appointments. So it's not like there's anything there's no racial agenda that's innocent of a class and political economic agenda. There's no political agenda within capitalism. There, I said the dirty word. That's not tainted by and shaped within capitalism. And if we don't face up to that, then we're not going to have much chance of doing much that's decent for the vast majority of working people of whatever color, but especially Black people.
Let me get your thoughts on one other question before we get our audience to ask questions and make comments. What kinds of constraints on speech have you observed, or what concerns do you have about constraints on speech in this post-2020 landscape?
Oh, is that for all of us?
Yeah.
I guess I'll start. And this is kind of the starting point for this conversation. So Vey, you're very sneaky with getting us back there. So good job. Which is, so one issue in Canada in particular is that, you know, with these online harm bills, right? So obviously this is a real issue. Like, I'm a Black woman. There's a reason why I'm not on Twitter, right? Even with not being on Twitter, the amount of racial harassment and abuse that comes into my inbox at any one time, if you dare to speak publicly as a Black woman, I just could not conduct my life in security if I felt like I had that coming in all the time. So I've made choices to divest from certain forms of communication. So that is real, and I'm not minimizing that. And it has real effects on how you conduct your life, what you say, how you think about what you're going to say. And of course, you just try and ignore and push past and you say what you have to say. It's not unique to me. Like, everybody faces this kind of pushback, but I don't want to suggest it's not real. But the solution has been, so in Canada, we're particularly now interested in hate crimes and online harms. Now, hate crimes is partially tied to this really problematic, like IRHA definition of anti-Semitism, but also, of course, very tied into policing. So at a time when we're very much talking about police budgets and how do we get rid of like these funds for the police, one way that the police have actually responded is saying, oh, we're the force that's in place to fight racism. You should, report your hate crimes to us. And we're going to come in and we're going to take care of this. And we're going to have this online hate stuff. So what, this idea of criminalizing online speech. And a lot of people are kind of all in on this. It's a lot of, Black and Muslim people and stuff have been like, yes, like we need more of this. I have concerns about it, obviously. Because if you actually look at how hate crimes actually take place, like how they're actually prosecuted in Canada, it's overwhelmingly like property crimes by anarchists and anti-capitalists that get hit with this. I did an article about our police chief who came over from Hamilton, and Hamilton's hate crimes unit, if you look at what they were actually charging, they have the most white supremacist groups in Canada, and they spend all their time charging anarchists for like ACAB and like the, anarchy symbol. So I think one thing we know from our history is that these laws don't benefit us and they will be overwhelmingly used against us. And we should be careful with that, whether that's the excessive sentencing around, Bissonnette. And of course, it doesn't mean that we want someone to go into a mosque and kill someone, but what does it mean when we open up sentencing to like American style sentencing in Canada? Not that we're some paragon of prisons, but that's going to rebound on Black people. It's already rebounded on Indigenous people with things like dangerous offenders, which are so largely designated as Indigenous people in Canada, even though they're not committing serious crimes, right? So that's one concern. And then the second one is obviously, what does it mean when we start saying that technology companies, who are huge corporations, and we've talked a bit about some of their donations as well. So this idea of these progressive corporation that people are attached to, and the fact that some of these corporations donated into BLM, like Amazon, Coke, like these are giving money into, how can you be a radical organization and then the corporate, like they want to fund you? Obviously, then your project cannot be radical, like it doesn't match up. And how do we have radical speech if we're going to say that Jeff Bezos or Jack Dorsey, what's his name, Jack, whatever his face is, and, Elon Musk, whoever, are going to become mediators of our speech. So I think there's been a very insidious way of, because of the very real harms we experience with racism, the very real hate crimes we experience, the real shootings in mosques and burnings of mosques, the real attacks on Muslim women in Edmonton, especially Somali women, these are real. But then we're being told that the solution is to turn to policing, surveillance, tech management, rather than that the solution lies in some kind of social organization. So those are some concerns I have, and then I'll throw to everybody else on that.
I guess I'll say I feel increasingly like I have no idea what people are talking about when they talk about free expression or free speech. And I usually feel like when people use these terms, they're not talking about the things that I'm thinking about. I'll give one example maybe to help illustrate this for me, because I want to tie it to our conversation about Black resistance, Black political struggle. Regis Korchinski-Paquette died just over 2 years ago here in Toronto after falling from a high-rise building in High Park after the police responded, and she, according to the information that we have, tried to flee from the police out onto a balcony and fell to her death. In 2021, Regis's family and community organized a march to remember her and to keep visible the demand for police accountability and for changes. While we were marching down Yonge Street here in Toronto, we were essentially ambushed by the police. We were getting close to the end of the march, and a big police wagon showed up on a side street very close to the end of the march, and then police horses appeared, and they were coming into the crowd of people marching in the middle of the road, antagonizing people, starting to grab people up. Organizers of the march were specifically targeted and arrested, and luckily there was enough of us that we were able to surround the wagon that was planning to take our friends away so that it couldn't leave. And after about an hour, those who were arrested in front of us were released. Do we have the right, when we're being attacked regularly by the police, to organize a march in memorial of somebody who died without being once again criminalized and victimized? Is that about free speech? Or when we talk about free speech, like, are we talking about a private corporate owned space that people are pretending is the commons where you might get banned or flagged. What the flip are people talking about when they talk about free speech? Because for me, I'm like, we're grieving out here and we want to be able to express to the public that we're not through fighting, that we continue to make demands, that we continue to show up, we continue to remember those of us who have been taken from us, and that we don't even have the ability to do that. But that's actually not seen as a denial of Black people in this city to be able to express ourselves. And what followed, I remember so vividly, the attack on all of us at Regis's memorial, because it was the beginning for me of a summer of watching people trying to defend folks who are living outside in parks in this city, and having hundreds of police officers descend into those spaces, beat people, throw people to the ground, destroy people's property, send people to prison. I know that that gets seen in the context of some kind of a, property struggle. We're on public property for whatever that means or whatever it is worth, but I tie that in very intimately to the idea of being able to express yourself freely, because if you don't have a place to go to express yourself, what is the expression about and how is it going to happen? But we had a whole summer of police by the hundreds beating down on individuals in parks, being like, we think people should be allowed to camp here once it becomes dark, despite the bylaw regime that may be in place. So I guess my feeling of what is free speech that needs to be defended and protected in this moment, in my own context, is markedly different from, for example, somebody being able to express hatred online, and whether or not that's going to be regulated in a semi-private kind of context. I am not dismissing those conversations as being unimportant. I just think that expression is so much more often about tweets and things like that than it is about people literally in the disappearing public square being able to say something without being vilified or attacked or made unsafe.
Reed, do you have a comment on this?
No, I think my two co-panelists have been very eloquent.
I just will add before we take the questions that the constraints that I have observed on speech in this moment is not really constraints on speech, but constraints on hearing, constraints on listening, and it's always been constraints on various constituencies and public's ability to hear discourses, to listen to discourses. To illustrate it briefly, using George Floyd, I often wonder why, I don't wonder why, I know why, but I wonder why people don't really focus on the fact that he was a big guy, and why he didn't do more to defend himself, why he didn't do more to speak more loudly, because they're not constraints on speech. Of course, there was a knee on his neck, but they're the inability to hear, the inability to actually listen, to be open. Like, what would have happened if he'd done that? Even worse, right? The worst part.
But on that point, though.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't this be, but I guess this is another facet that sort of, or a specter that haunts the discussion of freedom of expression too, which is what seems like partly what you're describing is the impact of hegemonic ideology, right? Because what people can hear is a function of what they can see and what they can hear, what they've been accustomed to screen in and screen out, layers of commonsensical understanding. Like often enough, for instance, just to take one common example, people will say things like, well, I know race is a social construction and it has no biological basis in fact, but there has to be something. And the sense that there has to be something is the expression of the folk understanding that they've operated with, right? That folk knowledge is things that we know to be true because we know them to be true, right? And so that when the facts, say, of scientific investigation bounce up against the folk knowledge, right, then it's a natural impulse for people to trust the folk knowledge right? Because that's what they've always known to be true, right? Against the new intrusive factoid, basically. But we see this about a lot of other things too. I mean, so that's part of it. But see, again, then that takes the question of freedom of expression, freedom to be heard, back into the cultural context, right? And suggest that part of the differential weightedness of like different voices within the community, right? Based on, again, presumptions of authority, either racial authority, gender authority, class authority. So I think that's, I'm kind of, well, I know I'm being kind of random, right, at this moment, but this is one of the problems that I've always had when we, well, yeah, when this issue comes up. And if you don't mind, like I'm going to tell a very small tale out of school. When I first went on the AAUP's Committee on Academic Freedom and Tenure, it was just around the time that the British Association of University Teachers had passed a boycott, divest resolution, right? To boycott the Israeli universities operating in occupied Palestine. And our committee met to discuss this. It was my very first meeting. I didn't really know the informal rules or anything like that. And my colleagues were wringing hands over what our position should be about what the BAUT had done. Well, Jim Turk, who is invisible here, at that point was executive director of the CAUT, and by convention met with our committee on a regular basis, which is how Jim and I met. And one of my colleagues, and I fell in love with him the moment that one of my colleagues turned to him and asked, well, what has the CAUT done about the BAUT's boycott? And Jim deadpan. I thought I may have caught like a little wisp of an impish smile around the corner of his mouth, but he just said, nothing, it's not our business, right? So the Canadian Academic Union, right, operates in a discursive context, given Canada's national culture, its own institutional history and apparatus, that it understands its lack of voice to pass judgment on actions of a foreign nation's teachers union. But the American Union had no such constraint because we live in imperialist America and we understand that we're supposed to pass judgment like on everything else, what else there is in the world. So then that also plays into how you calibrate and defend or exclude types of speech, for instance.
Thank you. Ange, let's invite the audience and listeners to participate in this lively conversation. Are there any questions?
Yeah, the first question is from Bruce, and Bruce asks, in the university, as in the large corporate world, there's an increasingly widespread commitment to EDI. Do you see EDI as something that is making an important difference to greater social justice in our society?
Well, I'll say one thing very, very quickly, that in the US, where it's incidentally known as DEI, what we're seeing more and more of in both sectors, both in academic life and in industry, is it's being used as a tool. And Elle and Desmond, I think, both have alluded to this already in the Canadian context, but it's being used as a tool to break unions, to break wage structures, and I mean to de-skill, and especially within the university, to extend managerial prerogative.
Yeah, I think, and I mean, I'd be a hypocrite because I pretty much got my job on an EDI initiative. It was a cohort hire, so obviously I would be a huge hypocrite.
Yeah, we all did, ultimately, right?
So like, I'm not going to say that I haven't benefited from it. I said that one of my issues is that it doesn't take politics into account at all, which is sometimes, I think, a much bigger vector in a university. Universities don't want things that will destabilize them, right? So universities are very happy to have black faces as long as you're willing to toe the line. Their problems come when they think you're going to disrupt the faculty meeting or demand things. The second piece I have comes from, I guess, personal experience. So I do a lot of work with incarcerated people, as you may have guessed from this conversation. And in Canadian prisons, speaking of free expression, people in prison do not have access to the internet in any form in Canada for anything. And that includes taking classes. So it's essentially a ban on any kind of higher education, because there is no university in Canada in this day and age that conducts their distance classes without them being online. So when I got to the Mount, I always kind of try to admit the people I know. So we just kind of get people into school, and then I basically go and morally pressure professors. And most people are into this because they understand the importance of this. But my point is that, you know, that isn't covered by really an EDI structure. The idea that there's a whole group of people that, because of CSC's policies, cannot get to a computer and can't even put in an application to go to university, which is online. You know, so that there's literally no access. Many of those people are Indigenous and Black, of course, given the prison population. So I guess, again, what I want from an EDI structure is for it to be like, why aren't we talking about making education free? Why aren't we talking about bringing the university outwards? Why should you have to get access to university? Why do you need why are we being so credentialed and so professionalized so that people now need masters and have to go into this huge debt in order to do basic jobs? You know, like, does a social worker need a master's to be a competent social worker? Is someone who experienced the social work system going to know intimately what that feels like and would be an excellent social worker? So I have a lot of issues around how it feeds into credentialism and how it stops us from having the conversation about free education, open access education, education for everybody, and really thinking about how universities are like parasites upon communities. We should be breaking that down. And instead it becomes, well, let's just get, 2 Indigenous profs in, right? Rather than, why is education not accessible to everybody at every point in whatever way they like, whether that's access to our libraries, which should be open and free. Everybody should be able to have a university library card if they want one, so I think I couldn't say I'm like, it would be so hypocritical for me to like boo EDI, right? Because I'm here because of an EDI initiative, but it's not enough. And I guess that's always my comments. I'm always so wary of a discourse that self-selects the ceiling and then doesn't pass us through that. So we say, we're just going to ask for this because it's, and we're just going to ask for, 3 Indigenous profs. Why? How did we decide on that? Why not, we're asking for this university to go free, set up on a reserve and make sure that everyone can come in, right? Like, and those may seem like pie in the sky. And it's not that I expect to get those things next year or in even a lifetime, but I think we have to have some form of trajectory towards them and some kind of plan, at least, for how are we going to proceed towards those things and not settle and say that we've already pre-settled. And I guess that's my concern in general with a lot of contemporary discourses. I feel that either we have absolutely just like a theory that floats out here and we don't really have a real interest or intent on getting it, so we just say it as a kind of performative thing to say, or we accept something lesser. And what we don't seem to be good at is actually concrete forming the organization and the steps and the policies that would bring us forward step by step in that slow work of organizing to say, where can we get to tomorrow? Where can we get to next month? Where can we get to next year? And how do we always keep in mind, which is very challenging, I think, in our own thinking, to sort of keep in mind what do we need. And this is, I guess, why I sound kind of hardcore on, like they were like, well, can't you like enjoy a judge? And it's like, I guess the reason why I get kind of not skeptical, but why I push on that is because I guess I'm also frightened in many ways that it becomes easy to settle. I think it becomes easy to get comfortable, and it becomes easy once, particularly we go out of our conditions. Once you're no longer precarious, it becomes easy to accept I'm tenure and I get all this access to stuff that I didn't get when I was precarious. What a relief. Instead of being like, how do I keep fighting for those who are precarious, and how do I come into solidarity, and how do I, so I guess those are my concerns. I think EDI often works into reifying the hierarchy, but just now there's new people in it and not dismantling it. And I think we need to really be always focused on how can we move towards dismantling it for everyone. I keep giving long answers, I'm sorry.
Well, no, Al, just one quick point. I mean, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And the thing to keep in mind is that the bourgeoisie is always playing the long game, right? And if we don't play the long game, then we're on their menu, basically. And one of the problems that we've had as a left on both sides of our border is the lack of the kind of disciplined left political organization. And I don't mean this dumbass sectarian parties, but the kind of serious, disciplined, popularly rooted left political organization that's capable of thinking strategically, you know, as an institution, and planning for the kind of trajectory that you want, right? I mean, we you know, we want the same things. We fought for 20 years down here for like a campaign based on a labor movement for free public higher education for everybody, and are still fighting for it. And the Sanders campaign picked it up, and we're going to be fighting for it after I'm dead. But issues of that sort are also the kind of issues that open people up to what government actually could do if, like, and I'll make a shameless plug here. We have a podcast called the Class Matters podcast.org. And our tagline for it is, what would the country look like if it were governed by and for the working class? And campaigns like the Free Higher Ed campaign, for instance, sort of dropping in people's head that these are possibilities, and they've existed in various extents and contexts previously, and it can help build the kind of organizing drive they've got to have. But yeah, I mean, the key, and I've appreciated the way that you've stressed this too, like the distinction between mobilizing and organizing, and organizing is what we need and need desperately, it sounds like, on both sides of the border. So thank you very much.
I'll say about EDI that its rise is coming at a time when more and more, for example, students are being allowed to opt out of student fees that would go to things like Black Students Associations. Mm-hmm. And it's actually like BSAs like the one at McGill, you know, Adolph, you were talking about the anti-apartheid struggles and like a pro-Palestinian struggles, I should say as well, like, you know, and fighting it through the university for like, what do we do? Are we going to boycott Israel? Those kind of things. It's a lot of Black student groups around Canada, actually, in universities and colleges who have been doing that kind of work. And so now, like, they're seeing their funding be taken away, but don't worry, we're going to have EDI now. I would really like an EDI audit across Canada, since it's been a couple of years now, and this is the new hip thing to do. I would like to know how much money is actually budgeted at every university and college in Canada for what they call equity, diversity, and inclusion. I bet it's a lot less than people are imagining that it is based on all of the fanfare. And I would like to see a breakdown at each institution of where that money actually goes. Because while you're paying for 12 people with jobs and with a life and with security to come and sit in a boardroom and have a nice meal, the Black students on campus are going to the food bank. And I would just much rather take the EDI money and make sure that more Black students have something to eat, or to make sure that groups and spaces that are specifically for Black students have a little bit of change so that they can continue to support Black students in the day-to-day struggles that they're going through on campus, and to organize. If the job of EDI was to fight, as Elle said, for lower tuition, if it was to fight like for grants and not loans, because so many people are going into debt, then the school wouldn't support it, because the school doesn't benefit from those things. It's a business. So it's insulting. Of course, you know what? You can get good out of any new initiative that you bring into an institution. There will always be good people who will try to go into those spaces and make the best of it. But that's not the point. The point is, what is the commitment of the university or college, and does it change just because they're literally going to throw like $400,000 a year at what they call EDI? Start a fucking food bank. I'm not even joking. The money would be better spent and would help more Black people. It would help more Indigenous people. Like, start a food bank. I don't want the EDI if I have to choose. I know that's making it simple, but for the sake of simplicity, we're imagining and investing something into the magic of EDI that is not there, in my opinion.
As Vershawn pointed out, or Vey pointed out, like, and then and you said this right off the beginning, like, the conditions haven't changed, and you've just brought another group of people into the same condition and either they leave, or they knuckle down to it, or they commit lateral violence because people are so stressed. So then all this mess happens that's placed on our shoulders, like, because the white institution doesn't care once the Black people start fighting with each other or whatever, because people are under pressure. And, you know, so all these pressures that take place that often fracture the community, that often create all these tensions. You know, we get these jobs, we have to go up against each other for these jobs, right? So now we're like every Black person coming out of a PhD is competing with every other Black person coming out of a PhD for the same 5 jobs now, you know? And what does that do to us if we haven't worked out how are we going to manage this ourselves? And the institution isn't going to help us do that. They don't care if now I hate this other Black person because they got a job over me or something. Like, they're not going to come in and solve that. So it in many ways puts it onto our shoulders. Now we have to navigate the institution and navigate, you know, all these tensions and problems that exist from being in that space too. And they don't really take responsibility for that, right? And you know, and then we have intergroup stuff like, oh, the Indigenous people got this and not the Black people, or now it's a Black hire, not Indigenous, and then we're pitted against each other. So I don't know. I don't think they put a lot of work or any work into thinking about those impacts between groups and within groups as well of these initiatives. And I think I've seen it be not because of us, because of the structure. These things can become very, very destructive, both emotionally and politically for people in these spaces. And I don't know if you want to jump in on that.
Sorry, I'm going to really just quickly say too, that to whoever asked that question, one of the really interesting things about having these kinds of discussions is that those kinds of, is this thing working? Hey, you know, they brought in a new police chief. Do you think it's working to change this like system, right? Rather than asking that question and hoping that people like ourselves can answer, I would just encourage people who have questions like that. Like, if you're particularly part of a university and that's why you're curious, help bring about this idea that I'm talking about. Ask your university how much money they spend on EDI and see how easy or hard it is to even get that information, because you will probably very quickly see that for all of the fanfare about EDI, when you start actually digging into the particulars of it, it's going to be hard for you to get that information. And if it's so helpful to us all, I think that that in and of itself says something, that we can't even know how these kinds of dollars are being spent and what on. So I challenge people. It's not up to me. I'm not a student anymore. I dropped out an embarrassing number of years ago. But it's not up to me to declare whether or not these things are good or bad. But I think like there is an answer, an empirical one that we can come to just by like, out of their whole budget, how much of it is EDI? And what does that tell you about their priorities? It's not really mysterious.
In the time remaining, let me ask Ange to give us 2 more questions. And from us, I'm going to ask us to give
short answers.
Short answers. How'd you know? Short answers. I love the long answers, but let's, if we can, give a short answer.
Okay. The next question, somebody asked, how does the Canadian Black struggle sync with the First Nations struggle, if it does at all?
Oh gosh, in short answers. Obviously, we have distinct histories. I think we've actually done quite a lot of work in many spaces, and Black and Indigenous people are trying to work more together on that solidarity, because there is historically a divide and rule between us, but also a lot of solidarity as well. So it's not the same struggle. And I think, you know, we do ourselves the wrong when we try and just lump everything, whether that's the idea of racialized people or Black and Indigenous together. We have distinct experiences, but obviously, you know, we have things in common to organize with. So especially, I think that's just an area that people are very conscious that we need to do work on between our communities. We obviously all we live within a colonial society, and we all absorb those ideas as well. So there's interwork to be done, you know, between what we've all internalized about each other's communities, and then particularly organizing work in many spaces that, so, I mean, Indigenous, the instrument of treaty is a really important instrument. It's the one thing that can stop resource extraction across Canada. It's a very powerful instrument. So we also have to understand treaty and what that means politically and what it means for us as Black people. You know, there's many Indigenous people in prison, again, that use specifically treaty and stuff to make challenges in prisons that are then benefiting Black people as well. So there's many ways that also when we understand Indigenous nations and what is happening politically there, I think it offers us ways of organizing as well. I'm trying to give a short answer. So that's my short answer.
In 2016, the year after Andrew Loku was murdered by the police. Andrew Loku, of course, was a 45-year-old Black man who lived here in Toronto, who was shot and killed in his apartment building by Toronto police. The year after that happened, when the police decided not to charge, or sorry, when the Special Investigations Unit decided not to charge the police officer, Andrew Doyle, who killed Andrew Loku, Black Lives Matter Toronto engaged in a 16-day long demonstration in front of the police headquarters in Toronto. And when they did that, Indigenous people in the city came and stayed the entire time, kept the fire going, fed people, held the space, talked about the traumas that had happened in their own communities, remembered the losses of people in Indigenous communities in Canada and in Ontario who'd been taken by the police as well. And then a couple of days after that demonstration ended, Indigenous people in different communities across Canada actually occupied INAC buildings, and then they're making a demonstration federally about Indigenous affairs relationship with the government. And a lot of the Black people who had been part of Tent City went and supported those demonstrations as well. And I want to give that example to say that I've been actually reading a lot of Adolph Reed in the lead up to doing this conversation. And one of the challenges that I think you have for us, Adolph, is really about like the concreteness or the maybe even like fickleness, if I will, of what really even is race and racial organization. All I want to say is that it was a sense of Black identity and a sense of Indigenous identity, respectively, that brought people to those spaces, created the possibility for those demonstrations. And while I think that the idea of race is almost impossible to define and concretize and categorize and systematize and validate in like a really coherent way, as a lot of your writing explores, it's nevertheless valid because it moves people to identify with a struggle and to fight back. And I think it is actually really important for us to continue to ask why it was, because anybody could have come and demonstrated for Andrew Loku, but it wasn't anybody who came out. It wasn't anybody who was willing to make those sacrifices. And when I see the actions that are taking place in my streets here, and when I see the even union organizing that's happening, and a lot of the day-to-day work for fighting for refugees and non-status people, is not just anybody who's in the so-called working class who chooses to step up to these fights. It's often racialized people, and more often than not, it's Black and Indigenous people. So these categories might not have the concreteness that we think that they might have, but we have to explore, I think, and always like reflect on the reality that it is often Blackness that is bringing people together, whether that is the most coherent category or like consistent category or not. There's something about our racial identities and then our abilities, for example, as Black people, to make a solidarity with Indigenous people, to explore the history of Black and Indigenous solidarity in Canada, which is another thing that we never talk about, which goes so far back. I think that that is a meaningful pursuit, even if it is incredibly messy and sometimes seemingly incoherent.
And just because we would be just people are both too. Let's like not pretend it's always two separate communities. Go ahead, Adolph. Sorry.
Thank you. Yes,
well,
thank you.
well, yeah, I was going to say that it also worked quite well for National Socialism, right? I mean, so it's a problematic notion, and where it can go, and what the limits of political mobilization and organizing are around the race idea are also problematic. I don't dispute that people can be drawn together on that basis. They very often are, and they very often are because the racial classification has something to do with the circumstances that they live within, because that's also what race was all about, right? But my point is that it obscures as much as it illuminates, and it can't get us to where we need to go ultimately.
I worry in our modern context that when we talk about wokeism and identitarianism and all of these things, that we're actually really delegitimizing the value that it has. It doesn't have to be everything. Of course, just using one vector of human identity to say that as a rallying point is going to have its limitations. But we're living in an era, and I've seen you talk a lot about not giving gifts to the right. And I think that sometimes when we go a little too far against what people want to classify as wokeness and identitarianism, we're actually invalidating the importance of gathering and thinking and organizing around racial category. So of course it's never going to be everything, but it's not nothing either. And as for the National Socialists, I mean, I don't know, you know.
Well, I mean, race was their ideology. That was the whole point, man. I mean, that's right.
We're going to take one more question.
We would need a whole other panel on that one, I think.
Yeah.
What we should agree on is that when you have erudite, passionate individuals, there's no such thing as a short answer. We just have performatively.
Sorry.
And the last one.
Yeah, the last one, on the topic of effective organization, if there were one form of organization or organizing that you could make happen right now with whatever funding would be required, what would it be?
Wait a minute, what?
Sorry, did I say that too fast?
If we could have one form of organizing, what would we have? I think kind of the point of organizing is you have many forms, right?
I was going to say the whole conversation has been sort of at least about more, not just one, right?
That's a good answer. We would have more. That would be a
more.
great answer.
But I mean, I think it speaks to something, and Adolph, you might want to talk about this. I think this speaks to sort of how we're also taught that organizing is, because there's celebrity organizing as well. I, again, have to have, you know, culpability in that, right? And there's reasons why the media likes me that are not hard to understand. I'm a light-skinned woman. I am educated, so that plays better, you know, like there's these things that play into who, and this is Adolph's point about who's chosen as a leader, right? And like, I'm not separate from that. I know why the radio might want to hear from me in ways they don't want to hear from somebody with like a thick Nova Scotian accent, for example, right? And that's not because the person's less intelligent than me, right? So part of the idea is that we have this idea that there has to be one kind of leader and one group, and then this one path of organizing. And that's what we've been taught, because so many of our organizing histories have been erased from us, or we, you know, the state induces amnesia. And then we really believe that Martin Luther King just marched across bridges by himself, you know, and not that there was all these women that were teaching how to organize, not that they learned from the communists in the field schools, not that that was attached to this movement. So I think part of the problem of modern organizing is that we have this myth that there's this, all we need is a charismatic leader in this one form of organizing that will take us there, when in fact we need to be, I think, organizing all over the place, wherever we are, in so many ways, and then trying to build. The problem is then getting out of that silo and trying to build between those movements so that we're in conversation. Adolph, you probably have more to say about this than me.
Well, no, I have one, I agree with you. One quip, I guess, is that when I first began to suspect that all was not right with Black Lives Matter as a political movement, like in the US, was that I noticed that all of the organic spokespeople sounded like they were ready for MSNBC. Okay, bullshit going on here.
Well,
That's all I'll say about it.
well, I would I'll answer as well. I would imagine a interracial or multiple racial, multiple gendered, multiple classed organization that was dedicated to the proliferation of various ideas and modes of engagement, where there wasn't just one right way, one like Booker T way, or one way, where this cross-racial, cross-gendered, cross all other categories would be promoting multiple avenues, aims, and means of achieving what EDI is supposed to achieve. That's what I would put my money in, or ask, and my effort. I personally don't really tend to identify with any particular group, because I like to identify with multiple groups. You know, I wouldn't say that I am a Black Lives Matter person, although I do work with Black Lives Matter groups. I write about Black Lives Matter, but that is not, I wouldn't identify directly, because I don't want to just be in one group. I think that we should be in, I would like to see groups that are committed to just a diversity of perspectives and needs. I think Jim is telling us that we have to wind down. Did you want to come back, Jim, and give us the final word?
Well, I don't have a final word. What really has been clear is that this has been a conversation that's raised a whole bunch of other conversations, and we could easily have a series of different panels picking up various aspects. That's the problem of trying to provide short answers to really important questions that take us in useful directions. But I did like your comment about how we have this way of understanding organizing as well. Rosa Parks just magically on the bus decided to do this rather than she had gone to the Highlander Center, and there'd been this whole mobilization, and Fannie Lou Hamer and all these people that most people haven't heard of were what made a lot of those organizing efforts work. I mean, there's that whole history that's lost, and we could have a session on EDI. I mean, there's so many things to unpack. So I'm so grateful to the four of you for a very engaging conversation that clearly we didn't begin to get through all the questions. Each of the questions deserved more time than we were able to allot to it. So I hope you'll consider the possibility of coming back for round two of some of the different aspects. So thank you very much. And I want to thank the audience as well for joining us today. I hope you found it as valuable a discussion as I did. A video of this conversation will be posted on the Center for Free Expression website on Monday. As well, we're going to ask the four participants in this to give us suggestions for some other materials that those of you who'd like to read more or see more videos or whatever about the issues they talked about today. We're going to have a list of resources you can turn to dig further. So that will be posted as well. This is the last of the CFE's panels for this academic year. We'll be returning in September. Our first series in September, or at least one of our first series in September, will be addressing threats to academic freedom. And the first three of that series will be looking at ethnic religious nationalism and academic freedom, looking at the challenges being faced by scholars of South Asia, and another session by scholars of China, and another one by scholars of the Middle East. We're also going to be continuing our series on press freedom. So videos of all our past events are available on our website, which is cfe.ryerson.ca. I hope you'll check them out. And if you find any of them of your interest, have a listen to them. Again, thank you to the panel and the audience for coming today. Hope to see you in the fall. Bye-bye.